Pretty early on, I realized that my family told interesting stories. However, the whole American culture and American media is telling you that you shouldn't write about rural places or rural people. And so I thought, well, I have to set this in New York City or Hawaii or, whatever. But as soon as somebody said, no, you should be writing about where you're from, that's when my writing really bloomed, when I knew that I could write about my own people. Hello, I'm Silas House. I'm a novelist and a music writer, and I also love to write about food. So I was very glad when the Southern Foodways Alliance gave me the opportunity to write this essay, which I'll read to you today. It's called A Crowded Table. I first knew the truth about our neighbor, Michael, when he was nearly beaten to death. He was thrown over a cliff behind our trailer, and his cries for help awoke me in the blue hour, when the sun had not risen, but the birds had started morning prayers. After I woke everyone, we stood on the high bank together, until they, too, heard his guttural moans. My father hustled down to pull Michael up through the tangled briars to where we had all gathered, my mother, along with my aunt and first cousin, Anne, who lived in a trailer right next to ours. Michael leaned weak and addled against my father as they struggled to us, his head down. Then the teenager raised his face, and all of us could see his two blackened eyes, the deep gash across his right cheekbone, his badly busted lip. But we could not see the bruises beneath his shirt where they had kicked and punched him while they called him a faggot. When Michael saw Anne, his best friend since childhood, he collapsed in tears. My father turned away, ashamed to see the young man weep. My mother and aunt went into action. "I'll make some biscuits," my mother said, cinching the belt around her housecoat. My aunt took a hard draw on her Winston Light and marched inside to start sausage for the gravy. After my father had done his best first aid on Michael, we sat at the round table in the small kitchen of my aunt's trailer and ate together. Cathead biscuits, gravy, sausage, fried eggs, fried apples, fried potatoes. My aunt and mother, true to our culture in southeastern Kentucky, never cooked a small meal. The silver sound of forks replaced the raucous conversation that usually sang out at our table. That night at supper, I realized that my parents knew why Michael had been beaten. Because, my father said, he was a queer, a sissy. My parents had most of it figured out, and Anne would fill in the details later. The boys had come up on Michael when he was walking home. They had beaten him mercilessly, and then thrown him over the bank right behind his best friend's home. My mother said she loved Michael and hated to see him treated like that, but he needed to learn to act like the other boys. They likely figured their 6-year-old, me, wouldn't know what any of this meant, but I did. In just a few years, these words and phrases would come to identify me. By the time I was 10, my father, uncles, cousins, and classmates regularly called me a sissy too. Even my phys ed teacher, a miserable, track-suited woman whom I now suspect was closeted herself, called me this height of all insults in front of the entire class. What could be worse than for a boy to act like a girl? I walked like a sissy, threw a ball like a sissy, sat like a sissy. I liked to read, which was sissified. I loved to dance and refused to squirrel hunt. I wanted to be in the kitchen, washing dishes, helping my mother and aunt cook, all sissified. That word was a brand that burned deep into my skin. The first person to release me from all this was my aunt, Sis. She was also a grandmother, a second mother, a protector who spoiled me. She let me cry when I needed to. Sis was a melancholy person who had a good cry every few days and swore by them. "I've got them old blues again," she'd say, dotting a pink Kleenex to her eyes. "Hand me my cigarettes." When I asked to help in the kitchen, Sis didn't turn me away. She taught me to fry eggs, string green beans, peel potatoes. Always eat one raw slice for luck, she said. Sis showed me how to fix the two most important things of all, biscuits and cornbread. She told me that bacon grease and buttermilk make just about everything better. Sis and I would sometimes sing and dance to records in the kitchen. She'd shuffle her feet to Bob Seger or Prince or Loretta Lynn as she peeled potatoes, a cigarette clenched between her teeth. One time, I noticed there were tears in her eyes as we danced. She turned away so I couldn't see. Maybe she had already figured out how much I was like Michael and how someday I might face the same violence for simply being who I am. Recently, the Highwomen put out a song called Crowded Table. The chorus goes in part, I want a house with a crowded table and a place by the fire for everyone. My family always believed in the concept of the crowded table. Won't you eat with us? The more the merrier. Now hush, there's plenty. Y'all come on and eat. Say the blessing. Throughout my childhood, especially in summertime, we were always getting together to eat at our house or my aunt's, the two centers of activity in our large family. White half-runners cooked with salt pork and new potatoes, freshly pulled green onions, tomatoes so red and ripe the sight of them made my mouth water, peeled slices of cucumber, corn on the cob, called roasting ears in my family, a distortion of the words roasting ears, cabbage fried in a cast iron skillet with lard, salt, a lot of pepper, and cornbread, always cornbread, the queen of every meal. For dessert, blackberry dumplings or banana pudding or cherry cobbler, perhaps a better than church cake, pineapple upside down cake, or pig-eating cake. Sometimes there was cold watermelon or cantaloupe, mushmelon in my family's parlance, always raised in my daddy's garden and heavily salted. Friends attended these feasts as well as family. They were usually folks who did not have much family to speak of, or had been turned away by their own. People like Michael, whose father never stopped taunting him for how sissified he was. To hear my family's pedigree, poor to working class, Appalachian, white, evangelical, all self-identifying hillbillies, some self-identifying rednecks, most staunch Republicans, a lot of people would be surprised to see who gathered at their tables. People of different orientations, gender identities, races, ethnicities, cultures, beliefs, and sensibilities have marveled at the miraculous density found in my mother's chicken and dumplings, the crispness of my aunt's fried chicken, the balance of crunch and softness that distinguish her buttermilk biscuits. But here is the part I have dreaded telling you. While my parents and my aunt always welcomed guests to the table, I am sure they would not have readily set a place for Michael if he had insisted on bringing a boyfriend. They would not have been so keen on pulling out extra chairs for the many people of different religions and cultures who have joined us if those folks had talked too much about worshiping different gods or no gods at all. Any conversation about Black Lives Mattering or a grandchild complaining about dead naming the hurtful act of calling a trans person by their former name would have been shut down immediately. They were always fine with people joining in so long as those people were quietly different. Throughout my childhood, I witnessed tremendous homophobia from both of my parents. My Aunt Sis, so open-minded and loving to me, was quick to allow casual racism to rear its head in disgusting language. This habit led to the only true arguments she and I ever had. Many of my cousins who have welcomed so many different kinds of people into our family gatherings are vehemently anti-immigrant and proud to openly condemn anyone who protests, whether it be for women's rights or racial equality. The sharpest blade of my life has been this dilemma: how to reconcile the fact that people I love and who love me possess such hatefulness, often defended by Scripture? I still don't have the answer, but I do have hope. Here's why. There is no monolithic Southern family. Mine is the one I know best, and I have witnessed great change occur within us. My parents, who once chatted at supper time about rounding up and forcing all gay folks onto an island, now welcome my husband and me to their table as a couple. They buy us joint Christmas presents, go on vacation with us, refer to us as a coupled entity, y'all. They support and adore our son, their grandchild, who has transitioned to male over the last couple of years. Sometimes, when we are at the lake or dining together in a restaurant, I stop to marvel that we are all out together, my parents laughing and unafraid of how people might see us. Over the past decade, my parents reluctantly began an anguished self-examination. They started to listen. They laid down their pride. This is the way forward for the South, for all of us, to listen, to possess humility, to look at ourselves, and ultimately to change. The future I imagine includes everyone who is willing to love, to gather all at a crowded table, and it includes letting the hate-filled ones know that they'll always be welcome, but only if they get themselves sorted. I can go on loving them, but it will be a quiet love, because there is a thin line between grace and enabling. I can sit at a table with those whose opinions differ from mine. I will sit at the table with anyone who is willing to be open-hearted. But I will no longer subject myself to filling my plate besides those who actively endanger the lives of others, who vote to take rights away from women and LGBTQ people, who refuse to admit that they too must work to help heal the wound of racism in our country. I can no longer pour glasses of sweet tea for those who believe the environment doesn't matter, that immigrant lives are inferior, who wrongly insist there is already justice for all. Over the past few years, there have been too many family gatherings I have disrupted by calling out my cousins or others. When they spout their disgust for differences, I'm considered the bad guy for defending myself and others. They lean into each other, laughing, and tell me I'm too serious, that I've allowed politics to divide our family. Once again, I'm just the sissy who thinks too much. Once again, I'm left to simply be thankful that at least I have my parents and that they have been willing to do the work of self-examination. Earlier this year, I saw Michael for the first time in decades. He had moved to Florida when I was a teenager. A cousin of mine passed away and Michael came back home to pay his respects. Not much has changed for him. He never really came out and has never had a public gay relationship. Sometimes a place and a people can do damage that can't be repaired. Michael has moved through his entire life afraid that if he isn't quiet about who he is, then he'll be beaten again. Negating and shunning have left their scars too. After the funeral, we went back to a family member's house where a local church had prepared a feast for the mourners. Michael and I piled our plates with ham, fried corn, hash brown casserole, sweet potato casserole, macaroni salad. We sat together at one of the long tables on the porch. I asked if he ever missed home. "I never thought I would," he said. "I thought I'd never look back, but I have, every day." All these years later, and he still wanted to be accepted in the South where he had grown up. I do too. But so far I've only found that acceptance at my parents' table. There's a small county-issued sign where I grew up, "Hometown of Silas House, author." A few years ago, someone spray-painted "fag" across it. My father took down the sign, scrubbed the spray paint away, and put it back up. There are few things that have broken my heart more than this image of him. My mother came to sit with us. She ran her hand down Michael's arm and there was an apology on her face. Before long, my husband and my father joined us, and we ate together. I believe in forgiveness and giving grace. I do not believe in offering myself up for a beating, whether physical or spiritual. To set a welcoming table in a truly new South, we must actively work to nurture others and aim toward justice together for everyone who's being oppressed and belittled. We must listen. The South of my dreams is a crowded table of many different colors and accents. Stacked on the table are platters full of the food I grew up with and delicacies I have never known before. My husband and I will be treated like everyone else. My cousins will be there. Their hearts and minds will have opened up to new songs and new dances. Everyone won't think the same way, but they will all bring love first and foremost. That's the table where I want to break cornbread together. Bless this food. Love your neighbor. Amen. Pass the butter. Thank you. Well, the older I get, the more I've been thinking about Michael and being such a little boy and witnessing that. And, I don't think that I thought until recently how much that probably affected my own coming out process and how much it solidified the truth about my community, and how while I knew people to be loving, I also knew that if they knew who I really was, that they would withhold that love from me, that they would see that love as a stamp of approval, that they didn't think that they could give as people of faith in that particular church, And so right around the time I was asked to write this essay, I had just seen Michael at that funeral. And I had just been thinking so much about that. And it occurred to me how that was all connected by food, because that was the immediate thing that my mother and my aunt did. That was how they went into action to help somebody, was to prepare this big breakfast, And then the next time I saw him again, we were eating at this funeral of my cousin, where it's still such a important part of the grieving process, the community coming together to bring us food. And it just made me think a lot about the way that often that is how I'm brought together with my family, that I have such political differences with, such difference of opinion about so much stuff, but we still eat together, And, often my mother will say before we eat, I don't want y'all talking about politics. I don't want y'all talking about religion. Let's just enjoy being together. And most of the time we adhere to that, but sometimes you just can't, it's, times are tense, and I think sometimes there's just a time when you can't be quiet. I feel like it's wrong to be quiet. And so, in those instances, you can't get through the whole meal, but still there's that universal, there's just nothing more universal than eating together,